Mom says you are my real dad, the one from the picture.
Huh?
Rain hammered the streets of Busanjin hard enough to blur the city lights into streaks of gold and white. Inside the back seat of a black sedan, Jihan-tae closed the tablet resting on his lap and looked out the rain-covered window. At this rate, the community center inspection will take another hour, his driver said apologetically. Across from him, Rohan Vale loosened his tie and glanced at the weather report on his phone. Nature clearly doesn't respect corporate schedules. Jihan barely reacted. Reschedule the final meeting, he said calmly. Rohan raised an eyebrow. You're actually giving yourself free time? I should document this historic moment. Jihan ignored him. The car slowed near a quieter street lined with small shops. Then the power flickered. Several people ran beneath umbrellas while others hurried inside nearby businesses to avoid the downpour. Rohan looked outside. There's a tea house over there. We can wait until traffic clears. Jihan nodded once. Minutes later, the bell above the entrance chimed softly as they stepped inside. Warm air immediately replaced the cold rain. The scent of ginger, cinnamon, and fresh herbs filled the room. Unlike the modern cafes he occasionally visited for business meetings, this place felt personal. Hand-woven decorations hung beside Korean calligraphy. Wooden shelves displayed tea jars labeled in both English and Korean. Behind the counter, a woman was arranging ceramic cups. The moment she looked up, the cup slipped from her hand. Fortunately, it landed on a folded towel instead of the floor. Her breathing stopped for a second. Jihan. 12 years, 12 long years. For one impossible moment she thought she was dreaming. Mirembe Akini quickly bent down and picked up the cup. Sorry, she said softly. Long day. Her voice remained steady, but her fingers trembled slightly. Jihan studied her briefly. Something about her face felt strangely familiar. Not enough to remember. Just enough to leave a faint discomfort in his chest. Are you all right? He asked politely. Yes. She forced a smile. Please sit anywhere you like. Rohan was already admiring the menu. This place is incredible, he said. Jihan, if you refuse to enjoy life, at least let me. The older woman helping in the kitchen laughed. You two must be visitors. We're trapped by the weather, Rohan replied. Then rain brought you to the right place. Mirembe lowered her eyes and quickly moved toward the counter. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it. She had imagined this meeting countless times over the years. In every version she had prepared herself. But reality was cruel. Nothing could prepare someone for seeing a ghost walk through the door. Because the last news she had received about Jihan years ago was simple. He had moved on. He had built a new life. And she had accepted that she would remain only a memory. Mommy. A tiny voice echoed from the staircase. 3-year-old Sifa came running downstairs with colorful beads bouncing in her hair. She stopped halfway when she noticed the unfamiliar men. Her eyes widened. Then she smiled. Without hesitation, she marched directly toward Jihan. Mirembe froze. Sifa. But it was too late. The child stood in front of him and tilted her head. You look sad. Rohan nearly laughed. Jihan blinked. Do I? She nodded seriously. My mommy looks sad too sometimes. Rohan grinned. This little one is very observant. Sifa looked at Jihan again. Then she pointed at him. I know you. Mirembe almost dropped the teapot she was holding. Jihan smiled politely. Oh? Yes. She nodded confidently. Mommy cries when she looks at your picture. The entire tea house became quiet. Even the rain outside suddenly felt distant. Rohan slowly lowered his cup. Jihan's expression changed slightly. Mirembe stood completely still. Sifa, she said carefully, come here. But the child continued happily. You have lots of pictures. Rohan looked between the little girl and Mirembe. Jihan's voice remained calm. My pictures? Sifa nodded enthusiastically. In the blue box under Mommy's bed. Mirembe reached her daughter immediately. "Sweetheart, remember what Mommy said about talking while adults are drinking tea?" Sifa frowned. "But I didn't tell the biggest secret." Mirembe's eyes widened. "Sifa." The little girl lowered her voice dramatically. "Mommy hugs the box when she misses people." Rohan nearly choked on his tea. Mirembe closed her eyes for a brief second. When she opened them again, she forced an embarrassed smile. "Children say strange things." Jihan looked at her. For the first time since entering the tea house, he noticed the sadness hidden behind her smile. Not ordinary sadness. The kind people carried for years. He gave a small nod. "I understand." Yet something inside him felt unsettled. Because when she looked at him, her eyes carried recognition, not curiosity, not surprise. Recognition, as though she had known him once, as though she had lost him. The storm finally weakened an hour later. As he stood to leave, Sifa waved enthusiastically. "Bye, sad uncle." Rohan burst out laughing. Jihan almost smiled. "Goodbye." But before he stepped outside, he turned once more. Mirembe was standing beside the counter. Their eyes met. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she quietly whispered, "Take care on the road." Something about those words tightened his chest. He had heard them before. Somewhere. Long ago. Back inside the car, neither man spoke for several minutes. Finally, Rohan broke the silence. "Interesting afternoon." Jihan looked out the window. "Rohan." "Find out who owns that tea house." Rohan looked surprised. "Business reasons?" "No." Jihan stared at the rain. "I just need answers." Late that evening, Rohan entered Jihan's office carrying an old file. His usual humor was gone. "I found something strange." Jihan looked up. Rohan placed a faded university archive photograph on the desk. The blood drained from Jihan's face. In the picture, a younger version of himself stood beside a smiling African woman. The woman was unmistakably Mirembe. Rohan swallowed slowly. "There's one problem." Jihan could barely speak. "What problem?" Rohan looked at the official report attached to the file. "According to these records?" He paused. "That woman died 12 years ago." Jihan did not sleep that night. The old photograph remained on his desk long after Rohan had gone home. He had stared at it so many times that the edges of the image began to blur. A younger version of himself stood beneath a clear African sky, wearing a faded volunteer vest and smiling in a way he no longer recognized. Beside him stood Mirembe, not the composed tea house owner he had met that afternoon. This woman wore glasses, her natural hair cut short, and her laughter seemed so alive that even a still photograph couldn't hide it. Yet the official report attached to the archive was clear. Deceased. 12 years ago. Jihan rubbed his eyes. Something felt wrong. Not because of the photograph. Because of her eyes. The woman in the tea house had looked at him with grief. Not surprise. Not fear. Grief. And grief belonged to people who remembered. The next morning, Rohan entered the office carrying coffee. "You look terrible." "I've looked worse." "Not really." Rohan sat across from him. "Do you remember her?" Jihan remained quiet for a moment. "Pieces." "What kind of pieces?" "Rain." Rohan frowned. "Rain?" Jihan nodded. "A bus station. A woman laughing. Tea." He closed his eyes. "And someone saying..." He stopped. The sentence disappeared before he could catch it. Rohan leaned forward. "Jihan." "Yes?" "People don't imagine memories." Silence settled between them. Finally, Jihan stood. "Cancel tomorrow's flight." Rohan blinked. "You hate changing schedules." "I'm staying in Busanjin." "For business?" Jihan picked up the photograph. "I don't know anymore." At a Mani tea house. Mirembe stood motionless in the kitchen while steam rose from the kettle before her. She had barely slept. Every memory she had spent years locking away had returned all at once. The way he smiled. The way he tilted his head while listening. even the calm tone of his voice. 12 years had changed him, but not completely. Her elderly assistant, Mama Yunja, watched her carefully. "You've poured hot water into the empty pot 3 times. Mirembe blinked. "I have? You have." The older woman crossed her arms. "Who is he?" Mirembe forced a smile. "A customer." Mama Yunja snorted. "Then I must be 20 years old again." Before Mirembe could answer, tiny footsteps echoed downstairs. Sifa appeared, carrying a stuffed rabbit. "Mommy, where's that uncle?" Mirembe nearly dropped the spoon in her hand. "He went home. But I wanted to show him Mr. Carrot." She held up the rabbit proudly. Mama Yunja chuckled. "The child already adopted him." "Please don't encourage her," Mirembe muttered. But even she couldn't stop the small smile that appeared. 2 hours later, the bell above the door rang. Mirembe looked up. Her smile vanished. Jihan stood at the entrance. Behind him, Rohan waved awkwardly. "We come in peace," he announced. Sifa gasped. "Sad uncle." She jumped from her chair and ran straight toward Jihan. Before Mirembe could stop her, the little girl hugged his leg. Jihan looked down in surprise. For several seconds, he simply stood there. Then slowly, awkwardly, he patted her head. Rohan almost burst into laughter. "The mighty chairman has been defeated by a preschooler." Sifa looked offended. "I'm 4. Yesterday you said 3. She thought carefully. "Today I feel 4. Rohan grinned. "I apologize." Even Jihan's lips twitched slightly. Mirembe watched the scene quietly. Something inside her chest hurt. Because 12 years ago, this was the future they once joked about. Not with each other. Not with marriage. Just silly conversations between young dreamers. They used to laugh about how Jihan looked uncomfortable around children. Now here he was, standing perfectly still while Sifa held onto his hand as if she had known him forever. "Would you like tea?" Mirembe asked softly. Jihan looked at her. "Please." Their eyes met for a brief second before she turned away. Neither mentioned the photograph. Neither mentioned the past. Neither knew how. As they drank tea, Sifa climbed onto a nearby chair and began drawing. After several minutes, she walked over proudly. "Look!" Rohan leaned forward. "A masterpiece." The drawing showed 4 people holding hands. 1 tiny girl, 1 woman, 1 man, and another man with glasses. Rohan pointed to himself. "I've been included?" "You talk too much," Sifa explained seriously. He laughed. "Fair criticism." Then Jihan noticed something. The little girl had drawn him holding Mirembe's hand. Sifa looked completely innocent. But Mirembe quickly placed the drawing face down. "Sweetheart, let's not disturb our guests." Jihan pretended not to notice. Yet something strange happened. For the first time in years, the silence around him didn't feel heavy. That evening, in a quiet apartment across town, Professor Naeun Choi adjusted her reading glasses while reviewing old papers. Her phone rang. She smiled upon seeing the caller's name, Rohan Vale. "Professor Choi, I'm sorry to disturb you." "Nonsense. How is Chairman Tae?" Rohan hesitated. "Actually, I think he remembers more than he realizes." Professor Choi froze. Her smile slowly disappeared. "Why do you say that?" "Because he found her." Silence. Long silence. The elderly woman sat down slowly. "Found who?" "You know exactly who." Professor Choi closed her eyes. For 12 years she had prayed this day would come, and feared it. After ending the call, she walked toward an old wooden cabinet in the corner of her study. Her hands trembled slightly as she unlocked the bottom drawer. Inside lay stacks of academic records, photographs, old project reports, and beneath them all, a single yellowed envelope. Time had faded its edges, but the handwriting remained clear. For Jihan. Professor Choi touched the envelope gently, then whispered to herself, "I should have given this to you long ago." Outside, the evening wind rattled the windows. And for the first time in 12 years, Professor Naeun Choi finally decided to tell the truth. Jihan arrived at Professor Naeun Choi's home just before sunset. The modest house sat quietly on a hill overlooking Busanjin. Nothing about it suggested that the woman inside had once supervised international programs across 3 continents. Professor Choi herself looked smaller than he remembered. Older, more fragile. But when she opened the door and saw him standing there, her eyes immediately filled with emotion. "You've become thinner," she said softly. Jihan almost smiled. "That's your first observation?" "It was always my first observation with my students." Rohan quietly excused himself and remained outside. Professor Choi led Jihan into her study. Books lined every wall. Photographs from countless years hung above neatly organized shelves. For several minutes, neither spoke. Then she placed a yellowed envelope on the table between them. Jihan stared at it. His name was written on the front. Not printed. Handwritten. His breathing slowed. "Who wrote this?" he asked, although part of him already knew. Professor Choi lowered her eyes. "Mirembe." The room fell silent. Jihan reached for the envelope carefully. His fingers trembled. The paper inside had aged, but the words remained clear. He began reading. As the sentences unfolded, something inside him slowly broke. She had apologized. Not for leaving him. For disappearing without explanation. She wrote about danger. About protecting her family. About promises she hoped to keep. And at the bottom of the letter, one sentence stood out. "If fate is kind, we'll meet again after becoming the people we dreamed of becoming." Jihan closed his eyes. For 12 years he had carried anger he never allowed himself to acknowledge. Anger toward fate, toward himself, toward the woman he believed had abandoned him. Now that anger vanished, leaving only grief. Professor Choi wiped her own eyes. "I wanted to give it to you." "Then why didn't you?" Her shoulders slumped. "Because I was afraid." Jihan looked up. Afraid of what? The people chasing her family were powerful. We were advised not to contact anyone connected to them. "You knew she was alive?" "Yes." His voice remained calm, but the hurt beneath it was unmistakable. "And you said nothing." Tears filled the elderly woman's eyes. "I thought I was protecting you." Jihan looked back at the letter. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Finally, he folded the paper carefully and slipped it back inside the envelope. "I spent 12 years mourning someone who wasn't dead." Professor Choi lowered her head. "I'm sorry." He stood and gently helped her up. "You already lost sleep over this for 12 years." The old woman stared at him in surprise. "You aren't angry?" "I am." He smiled sadly. "But not at you." The next morning, Jihan returned to Amani tea house alone. Mirembe looked up from the counter. The moment she saw the envelope in his hand, all color disappeared from her face. She whispered only one word. "Professor." Jihan nodded. "I know." Her hands tightened around the tray she was holding. "How much?" "Enough." Silence stretched between them. Mama Eunja quietly ushered customers toward the other side of the tea house, sensing something personal was happening. Mirembe removed her apron. "Would you like to walk?" 20 minutes later, they sat on a bench overlooking the ocean. Neither knew where to begin. Finally, Mirembe spoke first. "I wrote many letters." "I know." "I never stopped writing." "I know." Tears gathered in her eyes. "I thought you hated me." Jihan laughed softly. Not because anything was funny, because life sometimes became too painful for tears alone. "I thought you died." Mirembe turned toward him in shock. "What?" He looked out at the sea. "That was the information I received." Her hand flew to her mouth. "No. For 12 years, I believed you were gone." Tears slipped down her cheeks. "And for 12 years, I believed I had hurt you." Neither realized when their hands moved closer. Neither noticed when their fingers finally touched. No grand confession. No dramatic embrace. Just two exhausted people discovering they had both suffered alone. Then, Mirembe quietly said, "There are still things I haven't told you." Jihan nodded. "I know. My family disappeared because of my father's investigation. I know that much. But that's not all." Her voice trembled. "My brother." Before she could continue, Sifa's cheerful voice interrupted. "Tea, uncle." The little girl came running across the walkway with Mama Unja following behind. Jihan blinked. "You escaped." Sifa grinned proudly. "I am very fast." She climbed onto the bench between them and immediately handed him a small toy car. It broke. Jihan examined it. "Let me see." Within seconds, he fixed the loose wheel. Sifa gasped dramatically. "You are magic." "No." He smiled. "Just engineering." Mirembe watched them quietly. Her heart tightened again. Not from pain, from gratitude. Because despite everything life had stolen from them, kindness had somehow survived. Later that night, Rohan sat alone inside Aurora Robotics' legal office, reviewing old financial records connected to Mirembe's father's case. Most of it appeared ordinary, until one name caught his attention. He frowned, then looked again. No, that couldn't be right. He pulled another file, and another. His expression slowly changed, because the same name appeared repeatedly. Investment partnerships, consulting payments, corporate shell companies, all connected to one man, Park Dong-hyun, Aurora Robotics' own board member. Rohan immediately grabbed his phone. When Jihan answered, he didn't bother with greetings. His voice sounded unusually serious. "Jihan, what is it? I think we have a problem." Jihan sat upright. "What happened?" Rohan swallowed hard. "The people who destroyed Mirembe's family." He looked again at the documents spread across his desk. They may have been inside Aurora all along. Jihan arrived at Aurora Robotics headquarters before sunrise. Rohan was already waiting inside the legal department. The usually composed lawyer looked exhausted. Several folders covered the conference table. Neither man spoke immediately. Rohan handed him a file. "Start with page 12. Jihan read quietly. Investment records, foreign partnerships, old shell companies. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then he saw the name. Park Dong-hyun, one of Aurora's longest-serving board members, a man who had helped him build the company from its earliest days. Jihan looked up. "Are you certain?" Rohan nodded. "I checked 3 times. Maybe he invested without knowing." "I hoped so too." Rohan slid another document toward him. This payment was made 6 months after Mirembe's father disappeared. Jihan's jaw tightened. "How much?" "Enough to buy silence." The room fell quiet. For years, Jihan had trusted Park Dong-hyun, not as family, but as someone who had stood beside him through difficult years. Now doubt sat heavily in his chest. Before either man could speak again, the office door opened. A young man entered carrying a worn leather messenger bag. Tall, slim, serious eyes, short dreadlocks. He looked directly at Jihan. "You must be Chairman Tae." Jihan stood. "And you are?" "Jabari Akinyi, Mirembe's younger brother." The name alone explained everything. Jabari placed several notebooks and a flash drive on the table. "I've spent 10 years collecting evidence." Rohan blinked. 10 years? Jabari nodded. "My sister sacrificed her life to protect me. I couldn't waste that sacrifice." His voice carried exhaustion more than anger. "I thought I could finish this alone." He looked toward Jihan, but apparently, fate had other plans. Over the next 2 hours, they reviewed everything. Witness statements, financial trails, archived articles, hidden transactions. Piece by piece, the truth finally surfaced. Park Dong-hyun had not created the syndicate. He had simply chosen to protect himself. Years earlier, he discovered illegal activities connected to powerful investors. Instead of exposing them, he accepted money and remained silent. That silence destroyed lives. When the final document was placed on the table, nobody celebrated. because justice often arrived carrying sadness. Park Dong-hyun requested a private meeting after receiving Jihan's message. The older man entered confidently, but the confidence vanished when he saw the evidence spread across the desk. His shoulders slowly lowered. He didn't deny anything, didn't argue, didn't shout. He simply sat down. For a long time, nobody spoke. Finally, Park sighed. I told myself I was protecting my family. Jihan stared at him. And how many families did you destroy instead? The older man's eyes filled with regret. I ask myself that question every day. Jihan closed the file. The authorities can answer the rest. Park Dong-hyun nodded slowly, almost as if he had been waiting for this day. When security escorted him out, he looked much older than before. Not defeated, just tired. That evening, Mirembe stood outside the tea house watching the sunset when Jabari approached. For a moment, neither sibling moved. Then she wrapped her arms around him. Years of fear. Years of separation. Years of pretending everything was fine. All of it disappeared inside that embrace. I'm sorry, she whispered. Jabari shook his head. You protected me. I should have protected you better. You already did. For the first time in years, both siblings cried openly, not from grief, from relief. Later that night, after Sifa had fallen asleep upstairs, Mirembe and Jihan sat alone inside the tea house. The lights were dim. Only the sound of rain against the windows filled the silence. Jihan finally asked the question he had carried for 12 years. Why didn't you come back? Mirembe lowered her eyes. When my father disappeared, I became responsible for everyone who remained. She paused. I knew if I contacted you, you would help. Of course I would. That's exactly why I stayed away. He looked at her quietly. Tears formed in her eyes. Losing you hurt. Her voice trembled, but losing my family would have destroyed me. Silence followed. Then Jihan reached across the table and gently held her hand. Neither needed more words. Because after 12 years, explanations no longer mattered as much as understanding. Months later, Aurora Robotics launched educational programs in Kenya and South Korea in honor of the victims whose stories had been forgotten. Amani Tea House expanded. Jabari finally accepted a position mentoring young journalists, instead of chasing criminals every day. Professor Nayun Choi slept peacefully for the first time in years, and Jihan no longer spent nights alone inside his office. One Sunday afternoon, laughter filled the tea house. Sifa sat on the floor surrounded by toys while Jihan assembled a miniature robot beside her. Rohan watched with amusement. The mighty chairman has become a full-time mechanic. Sifa nodded seriously. He works for me now. Everyone laughed. Then the little girl suddenly remembered something. Wait! She ran upstairs. Moments later, she returned carrying a familiar blue box. Mirembe froze. The memory box. Jihan looked at her. She smiled softly. No more secrets. Together, they opened it. Inside lay dozens of old letters, photographs, pressed flowers. Memories carefully preserved through the years. At the bottom rested the picture taken in Kenya 12 years earlier. Jihan turned it over. Written in faded ink were words neither had forgotten. Let's meet again after we've fulfilled our dreams. Mirembe wiped away tears. Jihan smiled quietly. After everything they had lost, after everything they had survived, they had finally kept their promise. Sifa looked around in confusion. Why are adults always crying? Nobody answered. Then she crossed her arms dramatically. Can we stop crying now and eat cake? Rohan burst out laughing first. Soon everyone joined him. Outside, soft rain began falling once again. But this time, no one feared the storm. Because there were no more secrets left inside the blue box. Only memories, and a future they could finally share. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to Afrock Dynasty Studios for more unforgettable stories filled with love, hope, and second chances.